Hi, thank you so much for joining us here today for the RegenAg Challenge Demo Day. We appreciate being here today, even though it's virtual, but it's great seeing everybody. For those of you who are not familiar, my name is Yonit Tzor. I'm head of strategic partnerships and collaborations in GrowingIL. And before we start, I want to showcase today's agenda. Just a second. Can you see my... We'll start with a few opening remarks by the challenge partners, and then we will hear our keynote speaker from McKinsey Mumbai, followed with the finalist pitches by the corporate tracks and their companies, and we will close the event. So as you may know, this event actually it concludes the RegenAg Challenge, which was launched in September 2024 as part of a global initiative aimed to shape the future of regenerative agriculture. This challenge was developed as part of a strategic alliance with our partners at MIGAL Research Institute, alongside EIT Hub, Israel EIT Food, the Ehrlich Group, the Free State of Bavaria Israel Office, and the Bavarian State Ministry of Economic Affairs, Regional Development and Energy. Ori, Eric, Dana, Chen, Tina, Maayan, and Hadassah and Eden. Your involvement made this initiative possible, and we appreciate you as our partners. I also want to add to our corporate partners at ICL, Planet Hub, Startup Hub, Festo, Netafim, Beva, and Toom Venture Labs. It has been an absolute pleasure working with you, and we really hope you found this program valuable as well. Special thanks to Gadi Kenny and Yael Meltzer from RegenIL for going out of your way to help us promote this challenge and also connecting us with incredible speakers. We really, really appreciate everything you did for this program. And last but not least, thank you to the participating companies. We appreciate your dedication, and we hope that this experience was valuable and that you will continue your involvement in the world of regenerative agriculture. So as you may know, this program is aimed to promote regenerative agriculture and to motivate AgTech startups, corporates, and other stakeholders to be more engaged and adopt regenerative practices and technologies, which will ultimately strengthen their overall value proposition. And we've received over 85 startup applications coming from 22 countries worldwide. I think this is an astonishing number. Regen agriculture is a very small community, growing community, but still small, and we were humbled by the numbers and by the dedication of companies, AgTech startups, to shift their operations and learn more on regenerative agriculture. This challenge was mapped by the 4 participating global partners, corporations, which was followed with an in-depth screening process to really make sure that we're matching between the challenges and the provided solutions, the offered solutions. This process led to the selection of 14 companies who advanced into the bootcamp program. And during this process, we were glad to introduce to the corporations with companies that they did not encounter before, and at the same time introduce between startups for them to mutual synergize and examine potential collaborations. So some startups that took part in this bootcamp will continue working with the corporates beyond the program, in addition to the 4 POCs that you will shortly see that will be presented in a few minutes by the companies and by the corporations taking part as part of the RegenAg Challenge. I want to thank all the mentors and the speakers that took part of the program, and also our ecosystem partners. And then last, I just want to say that we launched last week alongside with Startup Nation Central and GrowingIL, the Israeli Agri-Food Tech map for 2025, showcasing over 750 companies from the agri-food sector. Use the barcode, screen it, and read the report that was attached to the map. And with no further ado, I would like to invite our dear partner, Eric Benmeir from MIGAL, to share a few words. Eric, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Yonit. So, yeah, I'm very excited. Today we are celebrating not just the journey this startup have taken, but also the entrepreneurial spirit, innovation, and commitment to bringing real solution, like I like to say, solutions to the field. Each team and participant really demonstrated professionalism, initiative, and technology maturity at the various level. It was great journey for my side. Exactly what agriculture needs to take to its next step forward. Yeah, thanks already been said, but I want to go back and huge thank you to the organizing team, especially for Chen, Yonit, and Dana. You are the best team to work together, and to our partners, EIT Foods and EIT Hub, Eden and Mayan, the Free State of Bavaria, Ehrlich Group, Herzog. Special appreciation is for the companies, from the industry companies, ICL, Netafim, BioAg, and TUM Venture Labs, and Festo, for their active engagement, forward-thinking approach, commitment to driving innovation that stays grounded in the soil, connected to the growers, and aligned with the ever-evolving agricultural landscape. I think we all agree that when you move forward at full speed, embracing regenerative agriculture, not just as a concept, but as a practical and scalable approach, its true potential will be realized, reshaping the future of farming and strengthening the resilience of our food system. We need you, and we're very happy you took this initiative. At MIGAL, we are very proud to be part of this revolution through this amazing program, the RegenAg program for farmers in the north of Israel, and our flagship project, the European Soil Health Living Lab Consortium, LILAS for Soil, led by EIT Food, which drives real-world demonstration of regenerative agriculture at the European level. Please stay tuned and watch us. So let's keep waking up every morning, not just asking what kind of a world we want to live for our children, but more importantly, how can we shape it today? So good luck to all, and thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Eden, just a second, sorry, just a second. Eden Dvir Zano, I welcome you to join us on the virtual stage. Eden is the Managing Director at EIT Hub, Israel.
Hey all, just a thumbs up if you can hear me. So hey, nice to meet you. My name is Eden Dvir Zano. I'm the Managing Director of the Israeli EIT Hub. Just a small recap for those of you who are not familiar with EIT, although I do hope that by now you are familiar and you can do the speech better than I do. I'm just going to say that EIT is European Institute for Innovation and Technology. We are the largest innovation network in Europe. We were established in 2008 as part of Horizon Europe, with the mission to drive innovation across Europe in a sustainable way and also to solve some of the world's greatest societal challenges. And since there's a lot of EU body that has a similar mission, the way that we do it, our method of doing it is we build partnership, private-public partnership, and we bring together to the table all the relevant stakeholders across education, businesses, researchers, in order to commercialize solution in a large scale to solve those global challenges. We call those partnership KIC, Knowledge and Innovation Communities. EIT has 9 different KICs. EIT Food is just one of them. But throughout the KICs, the different KICs, we have 2,400 partners, and we have 70 innovation hubs across Europe, which basically means that in every state across the EU, there's a local team that speaks the local language, that are engaged daily with the local stakeholders, that understand the regulation of the local ecosystem that they are operating. And we do that in a local scale, but also in a pan-European scale. So as I said before, one of those KIC is EIT Food. They have the mission to build a resilient food system that is healthy, sustainable, and trusted. Basically, if you want a future fit food system for all that will fit all, us in EIT Hub Israel, we are fully aligned with this mission. But not only this, we also take a advantage of another EIT core capability, which this is to help startups scale on a global landscape. And the way that we do it is by programs like this RegenAg program, in which we bring together to the table startups and corporate partners. This challenge was actually as a result of one of our broader effort to support Nation Initiative, which is, which as Eric said, this is a concern during the day one, but it was part of our program that we hosted a year ago. So obviously for us, it was just natural that we will take place in this great program. So just to say thank you for our fantastic partners, Yonit and Dana, you are the best, from GrowingIL and the Bavarian government and MIGAL and all the rest. Best of luck to all the startups. I'm looking forward to hearing your pitches. It's just the beginning of your journey. It's a long one, so use every support that you can. Feel free to reach out to me, to Mayan, to everyone from the EIT Food that you met. Leverage this connection. This is why we are here. And back to you, Yonit.
Directly. Thank you so much for joining us here today. The virtual stage is yours. You're welcome to share your screen.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen all right?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for giving me an opportunity. I'm Pradeep. I'm a partner at McKinsey. I have been a consultant for 17 years, and I co-lead our ag practice in Asia. I think the last 10 years I spent in the US and just moved back to Asia.
Sorry for disturbing. I think you need to swap display.
Oh, is it?
Full screen. Yeah.
1 second. Is it better?
No, we are seeing your preparation slide, basically, not the full screen slide.
Does this work? Is it better? Okay, great. Thank you for giving me an opportunity. I think today I'd like to sort of spend a bit of time reflecting on, I think, some of the work that we're doing in regenerative agriculture, and hopefully that would throw up some learnings for the group here. I think the context of this work was, I think, a couple of years ago in the US, I think there's just been a lot of conversation around regenerative agriculture. Not surprisingly so, given the footprint that agriculture systems tend to have on the environment at large, right? I think especially USDA and other major stakeholders have got together and said that we really need to address this issue. But then we felt like as a firm, there was just a lot of misconceptions around what would it take to really catalyze the field, because we thought the conversations were rooted more in emotion and less on analytical facts. So we spent about 6 months trying to really understand what would it take to scale, and actually brought economic analysis to bear to address this topic. So this is a bit of a summary of that work. But the starting point of our work was obviously, I think, agriculture is a huge environmental footprint. A lot of you know some of the facts. I think 70% of biodiversity loss, 80% of nutrient pollution, about 30% of emissions. So obviously this is a major issue. But then what we figured was that I think everyone's sort of talking about regenerative agriculture as a way to address planetary health. I mean, irrespective of which definition would you use, right? I think largely, I think there was a conversation around how do we really drive better practices to improve soil health and therefore the future of the ag system. And I think that was a real conversation. But as we looked at the facts, very few farmers globally, and also including the US, which is one of the most advanced ag system from a productivity point of view, I think has failed to sort of really drive large-scale adoption of regenerative ag practices. So if you really look at it, no-till, and I think beyond no-till and optimizing fertilizer application, I think most practices that generally people would agree are good for soil health have not been adopted at any meaningful scale, right? If you look at it, trees and cropland are less than 5% of corn acres in the US. Even cover crops, which a lot of people would assume, I think, are well understood, less than 20% of US farmers actually adopt them, right? So, and forget about advanced practices. So we found this paradox to be quite interesting, where on one hand, I think there's enough scientific evidence suggesting that people should be adopting these practices, but indeed, I think they were. So what we did was, I think we actually then took an economic lens and said, right, what is the real value that, I think if you were to pick at least a couple of practices where there's relatively less controversy, which is no-till farming and cover cropping, what value could that really unlock in the US agricultural system, especially in the Corn Belt, which is the Midwest, right? And not surprisingly, I think we found about $20 to $80 billion, I think, of incremental value that you could drive by implementing regenerative practices, right? I mean, come to think of it, I think this is purely economic analysis. You don't really have to monetize carbon. You really don't have to monetize, I think, higher premiums in the supply chain. Purely from a cash flow perspective, which comes from, I think, increased yield, more cost savings because of better application of inputs, and improved farm value. And we did the farm value increases less on speculative value, but mostly in terms of intrinsic value based on increase in cash flows, right? And we found that I think this, I think, is a bit of a no-brainer, because if this is the value that you could really accrue to the US farmland, then why wouldn't you do that? In addition to co-benefits, of course, which is, I think, carbon sequestered and water saved, right? So we dug further and asked ourselves the question on, does it truly apply to all acres in the US farmland, right? If at an aggregate level, if the information that we showed you, if you assume that it's correct for a moment, right? So we wanted to dig in further to understand, are we missing something here? Because I think at the big picture, it all sort of seemed to make sense, but people don't seem to be really adopting these practices. So what we did was we actually did an NPV for farmers over a period of time, right? And again, I think this also is a positive story where largely a significant majority of acres have positive NPV. Only about 4% of the farmers. I mean, this probably, I think, NPV that was not really large. And the break-even times are not that bad either, right? I think generally farmers would break even in vast majority of acres in 2 to 3 years. I think in some other acres, I think using these practices in 3 to 5 acres, right? So I think that's the positive side of the story. But then what we figured, if you really dig in and understand the economics, I mean, these are interquartile ranges of NPVs across different climatic conditions. We actually took a cut by agroclimatic zones and said, does it really change the picture? And there we figured that, listen, on small set of farms, we do find that I think the NPV could be problematic, especially if people were to implement only cover cropping, right? But generally, I think if you look at it, if you do no-till and cover crop, I think there's largely a positive story still. But I think when you unpack and look at some segmental segments, I think you find that there are probably, I think, some challenges on NPV, and break-even times in some cases tend to be much longer than others. So it's not a uniform story across, but it still doesn't take away from the positive story. And then I think what we figured is, if this was true, if the NPV was true, what is the free cash flow deficit that farmers are likely to face? And I think there's a bit of a complicated chart, but let me try to explain. I think in simple terms, what we're saying is, till the time the farmers actually break even, there's about $2 to $8 billion in cash flow impact that farmers on an aggregate basis face when they're transitioning these two practices, which means that largely it's a positive story, but then farmers who are, in some cases, don't have huge capital accumulation tend to, I think, find it difficult to fund the transition, right? I think that, coupled with the fact that if you actually do not believe in the numbers that McKinsey put out, then there's also an uncertainty around whether implementing the practices would truly give you the yield improvements and cost reductions. That uncertainty, coupled with, I think, the cash flows, which is, I think, about $2 to $8 billion in deficit, actually cause farmers not to really transition into these practices, because this obviously is a big number that somebody needs to fund, right, for the farmers to be able to do so. Arguably, I think some of the large farmers with strong balance sheets may be able to fund this by themselves. But in large part, I think this is something that I think policymakers and I think people in the ecosystem need to pay attention to. I think so effectively, this is another way to show it, but it tells you that there is a bit of a value of death. I think this is something that people speak about, but I think we've quantitatively established that I think there is a value of death, but in reality, the value of death is still not very long. So therefore, it's very important to sort of think about how do you really fund this. We then sort of said that, listen, I think obviously we get the economic case. I think, is it only economics that stop people from driving change or adopting these practices? The answer is no. I think there are actually non-economic barriers that stop farmers from transitioning as well. Right? One is, I think a lot of farmers actually require technical support. Right? More than 40% of the farmers said in a survey that we recently ran, saying that they don't really have the know-how to be able to really practice regenerative practices. I think somebody needs to help them. About 40% of them also said that we don't really have the inputs, tools, and technology required. But 35% of the farmers said that the risk or the uncertainty which is involved in, I think, the cash flows that we're projecting obviously also makes it really hard. Interestingly, I think this is not just a US issue, but given a lot of tenant farmers, there's also a question on, I think the tenant farmers actually get impacted by short-term cash flows, but they don't really get impacted. They don't really get the gains of future incomes. And therefore, a lot of farmers also said that we have an issue because we don't really have land ownership. So we may not be able to realize the full value if we were to implement these practices. And then the last one is, I think, but the good news is about 70% of the farmers said that they're willing to try. Right. So in general, if you look at it, I think there's just a lot of non-economic barriers in addition to the economic barriers for the farmers to really transition to regenerative agriculture. So what we said is, I think, what are three things that I think the field at large could do as you're trying to help the farmers make this transition, right? One is obviously, I think, how do you actually mitigate this valley of death, as we call it, or I think the free cash flow deficits, and how do you really fund them is obviously a big question. And I think there are adequate examples where I think public investment has helped farmers sort of transition through this valley, but in some cases, there could also be other mechanisms to do so. The second one is, how do you provide farmers with extension services and I think trusted advisor networks to be giving them the know-how and actually prepare realistic transition plans? I think one of the things that we've observed is, I think, over the last 5 odd years in the US, a lot of companies have started helping farmers to transition to regen agriculture, promising the gains of carbon markets and I think how they could actually get carbon credits for the practices that they would implement. And there's a lot of mistrust amongst growers because they haven't really seen the value. And now the carbon markets have collapsed, right, over the last couple of years. So therefore, there's also a question on how do you actually reliably generate advising network that is viewed as neutral and that could provide independent, unbiased advice to growers is important. And the third one is, I think, obviously monitoring a lot of this and doing fact-based projections is really important. So how do you really build mechanisms for, I think, both verifying that the practices are indeed giving them the benefits, but also if you really think about generating new cash flows through carbon markets, then things like MMRVs and the cost involved with that also sort of become expensive. All the three are sort of equally important. Maybe a couple of minutes on each one of them. I do sort of think that this page is conceptual, but I think in simple terms, what we're saying is a lot of times when we think about funding free cash flows, I think often people don't really think through, is it actually financing or is it a grant, right? Or is it a subsidy? And even policymakers don't have clarity around how to drive that. We actually think that it's really important to, I think, design both the financing mechanisms from a private sector perspective or public lending or grant mechanisms, depending on which farmers are you supporting. So therefore, there is a need for greater evidence to sort of support farmers, support policymakers so that they're able to catalyze the right financing for the right farmers. Not all farmers actually require grants. And I think this is an important piece because generally a lot of governments are, I think, in developing markets that are also trying to sort of transition to regenerative agriculture get overwhelmed by just the size of investment that's required. And we often say that it's not that large if we really unpack and support growers that truly need I think, subsidies versus others purely require financing. So therefore, there are other ways to catalyze that. I think there are roles that different stakeholders could play to provide advice. And we do sort of think that this also doesn't have to be purely relied on from an extension agents of the government. So I think there are ways to sort of deliver different pieces of the advisory puzzle by different ecosystem players. And the last one is, I think, we do sort of think that there's a big role that technology could play in actually lowering costs. We picked a few examples around yield monitoring, fertility prescription, and so on. But even in MMRB, we are seeing a lot of interesting use of digital applications, technology tools that can lower monitoring costs quite significantly. So therefore, I'm sure there are a number of you in this room that potentially see opportunities to invest in and commercialize, innovative ways to, monitor those. So, and those are three pillars which we think are pretty critical as we look to transition the ecosystem. By the way, the good news is, I think there are already ways in which different elements of these are being implemented, albeit at small scale, right? I think in Kenya, there has been a program to drive regeneratively produced whole grains into the school meals program and retail procurement, and where I think there's been a lot of innovation around financing, where public and private sector have come together and they've started implementing programs. So there are some learnings to be had, right? There's also, I think, in Brazil, I think there was an Amana Trust, which is an independent financial institution that is running a major program, again, trying to sort of convert essentially degraded land and actually improve the soil quality. But I think they're actually then connecting these farmers into public markets, and they're actually setting up a brilliant finance facility alongside the government. In India, there's been a lot of work on especially reducing fertilizer use rate because of policy changes. And I think there are some interesting examples here. I'm happy to sort of share these cases in detail. But I think the notion is, I think this is not, it's not unfathomable to imagine that I think with a little bit of support from the governments, and I think private sectors can make a meaningful difference and start implementing these at reasonable scale. And we're seeing pockets of that already happening around the world. So how can you sort of help as a bunch of really talented companies and innovators that are looking to address this issue? One is, obviously, there's a huge role in financing, as we mentioned, and therefore anything that you could do there could be meaningfully important to this issue globally. The second one is, I think, the whole advisory services extension, I think, and could you really drive, through innovative solutions, could you actually deliver these services to growers across the world? I think still in developed markets with large-scale farms, this could be done, but in fragmented environments, I think obviously there's a bigger question on how these can be delivered in a cost-effective way. And the last one is, I think, as value chains would be reorganized to deliver regenerative farming solutions, I think there are both pockets of opportunity, but also I think you as value chain actors could also have an important role to play to think about what products and services could you offer. So I hope I kept your time, and really thank you again for giving me an opportunity. Hope this was helpful.
Thank you so much. I think it's always interesting and refreshing to see more views and talking about, the transition to regenerative agriculture, and super interesting. We might have a few minutes for questions from the audience. I think we had a question in the chat about from Raymond. Would you like to voice your question?
Sure. I think, Raymond, it's actually hard to be super precise, because the reason why this is a range is driven by three things. One is, I think, we actually are aggregating, I think, interquartile ranges. So the bottom quartile versus top quartile returns, I think from a yield perspective, from a cost perspective, actually vary quite significantly. So when you aggregate them, I think it becomes quite problematic. So therefore, I think the ranges at an aggregate level seem broad, but if you really dig into individual farmer segments in individual agroclimatic zones, I think you find a little bit of narrow ranges. So I think happy to sort of share more data, but I think that's just a reality of aggregating a bunch of discrete farms or farming systems.